going to talk about the postcolonial approach to the study of literature. Yesterday we referred to feminism. Of course, I said there are different waves in feministic approach, a critical approach to the study of literature. It started with a political movement, and it was influenced. The third way of feminist approach, critical approach, was influenced by post-structuralism. In the same manner, post-colonialism also came under the influence of post-structuralism. Before that, I would like to tell you that in this particular presentation, I'll be talking about the idea of the post-colonial theory, which is also known as colonial discourse analysis. And we shall be referring to three key notions over here. The first one is Edward Said's Orientalism. The second notion that we shall be talking about is Gayatri Spivak's subalternity, and then Homi Bhabha's mimicry. Of course, by and by, I shall be talking about Fanon as well. Firstly, let's try to understand how post-colonialism draws from post-structuralism. The third way of feminism also draws from post-structuralism. Similarly, post-colonialism has its indebtedness to post-structuralism. The post-colonialists were influenced by the post-structuralists like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Jacques Lacan. All these post-structuralists exercise a very deep influence, not only on post-colonial theory, but also whatever has happened in literary theory after 1960, during 1960s and 70s. When we talk about, as our discussion is limited to post-colonial theory, when we talk about post-colonial theory, Michel Foucault had his great influence on the theorists, especially on Edward Said. So we see the influence of Foucault on Said's work. Of course, other two post-colonialists, Gayatri Spivak Chakravarti and Homi Bhabha, also draw from Foucault, but we can see the great influence of Foucault on Said's Orientalism. And in case of Gayatri Spivak, there was an influence of Derrida. And in Bhabha's case, we can see the influence of the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. So with this background, let us have some discussion on post-colonialism. So as I mentioned earlier, all these three post-colonialist thinkers were deeply influenced by Foucault. Especially, they were influenced by Foucault's views of power. As power becomes a key concept, a major issue in post-colonial theory. So they try to draw from Foucault's definition of discourse. Michel Foucault talks about discourse in the context of power. Discourse for him, or to him, is a system of statements. We need to understand these terms. Discourse is a system of statements. And within this system, and within which and by which the world can be known. Means the world can be understood by discourse, which itself is a system of statements. In yesterday's lecture as well, we restricted our discussion to literature because feminists thought that academy has a very important role, in determining the perception. In a similar manner, Foucault's idea of discourse should be understood. For him, discourses are ways of constituting knowledge together. Now, knowledge is constituted together, and discourses are nothing but the ways of bringing together knowledge. And how knowledge is constituted together with the social practices. Now, whatever social system that we follow can be understood as social practices. For example, the way we live, the culture that we follow, all these are the aspects, our value system, our belief system. Everything falls under social practices. The festivals that we celebrate, the manner in which we celebrate all these festivals, the food that we use. So discourse has a role to play in determining our social practices. So there are ways of constituting knowledge together with the social practices. Apart from that, discourses are the ways of constituting knowledge together with the forms of subjectivity in individuals, whatever perception that we develop. In that, discourses has a very important role to play. Discourses are also important once we understand that discourse is a system of statements within which and by which the world can be known. We understand that discourses have their relation, they determine power relations. And these power relations come from, inherent in this knowledge, that whatever knowledge is what we call constituted in discourses. So what we understand here is that a knowledge system is connected to social practices, is integrated to social practices, are forms of subjectivity, and even power relations. All these factors come from, originate, inhere in such knowledge. And discourses are also the ways of understanding the relations between them. Then, in the similar manner, Foucault tries to define power, the concept of power. So what he says about power is that it is a relation and it gets exercised within discourses. Now, we should have the clear-cut idea of discourse. Discourse can be a written or spoken debate. What means, for example, political speeches are the examples of discourses. Scriptures are the examples of discourses. Literary works are the examples of discourses. So discourses can be understood as spoken and written texts or debates. So power gets exercised within discourses, within the argument, the knowledge that we present, in the ways in which these discourses constitute and govern individual subjects. All of us, being the part of the society, being the individuals, are governed by these particular discourses. Our way of looking at the world, our perception, our thinking, everything is governed by. So you can bring structuralism here, bring in structuralism. So what we call the deep structure and surface structure. So you know very well that the surface structure is an outcome of the deep structure. So it is the what we call manifested knowledge. So whatever manifested behavior that we come across is governed by the deep structures, their discourses. So this is what we understand in the context of Foucault's view of power. He continues with this kind of discussion on power. We are referring to one of the important work by Foucault, The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, an introduction. In continuation with power, I would like to quote here what he says about power. So I have underlined certain statements over here. So we need to focus on these statements. So Foucault defines power as the multiplicity of force relations immanent in the spheres, multiplicity of force relations, which are immanent in the sphere in which they operate and which constitute their own organization. So this is the first part of his definition. He defines power as the multiplicity of force relations. And these force relations are immanent in the sphere in which they operate. For example, we can say individual life, in our social life, in our political life. These are the different spheres. In our educational life. So in all these spheres, these force relations are evident, are immanent. They are not in a single form as such. They exist in multiple forms. And they operate and constitute their own organization. How? So there are different ways in which they operate and constitute their own organization. Yesterday as well, we talked about the correlation between the institutions. We talked about the church, we talked about the what we call academy, we talked about the court, law, etc., government. So all these are the institutions. In the similar manner, power relations or force relations operate and constitute their own organization. As the process is how they operate and how do they constitute. They operate and they constitute as the process by which, through ceaseless struggles and confrontations, transforms, strengthens, or reverses them. So this is an ongoing process. It is a process. An opposition, there are confrontations, and through these ceaseless struggles and confrontations, it transforms. Sometimes it changes. Sometimes it gets strengthened, or sometimes it is reversed. It is rejected. Secondly, we are talking about the way power relations or force relations operate. So they operate as a process through ceaseless struggles and confrontations. Secondly, the support which these force relations find in one another, and they form. Well, we were talking about Foucault's view on power, and we refer to the way it operates, the way it constitutes. We talked about the process by which it operates. At the same time, it strengthens, it transforms, it reverses. It exists as the support which these force relations find in one another, and they form a chain or a system. Okay, this is one of the aspects that we need to understand. Similarly, on the contrary, the disjunctions and contradictions which isolate them from one another can also be understood as force relations. There can be the moments, the events of disjunctions going away from what we are trying to understand here. There can be contradictions, and force relations can isolate. As they constitute together, they also isolate them from one another. Lastly, he says that the strategies, they exist as the strategies in which they take effect. whose general design or institutional crystallization is embodied in the state apparatus. So this is very important. The state uses it as an apparatus, as a tool in the formulation of the law and in the various social hegemonies. The state, by state we mean the government. So the government uses the power as an apparatus, as a tool in the formulation of the law. And it also is visible in various social hegemonies. Hegemony was the term first used by the Italian Marxist thinker Antonio Gramsci. So hegemony is used in the context of dominance of a particular cultural group or social group. So government or the state uses it in the formulation of social hegemonies. So in this context of discussion, we need to understand postcolonialism. So when I said that Foucault's ideology has had a deep influence on Edward Said and Spivak and Bhabha, we need to understand postcolonialism from that point of view. Now, what is postcolonialism then? Postcolonialism involves a studied engagement. I'm not going into the definitions of postcolonialism. There are different definitions, at the same time different terms without hyphen, with hyphen. I won't be talking about all those things. So postcolonialism involves a studied engagement with the first thing, the experience of colonialism. Whatever happened after colonies were established. Secondly, its present effects both at the level of ex-colonial societies, for example, India, Nigeria, etc., South Africa. These are the ex-colonial societies. Now, what happened after colonialism? Or it is engaged with of more general global developments, thought to be the after effects of empire. So you must be knowing something about the book, The Empire Writes Back, by Bill Scroft and others. So it is one of the important works in the field of postcolonialism. Rather, the discussion on postcolonialism came into highlight after the publication of The Empire Writes Back. Otherwise, it was there, but the term Orientalism and all other aspects came to be known to the world after Bill Scroft and others' book was published. Let's understand the concept of postcolonialism briefly. I'm not going into, as I said earlier, into the different definitions of postcolonialism. Yes, there are postcolonialism is used with hyphen and without hyphen. And with hyphen, it is thought that it is a continuation of postcolonialism after colonialism. But when we understand the term postcolonialism, it refers to a set of theoretical concepts. It refers to different approaches and even interventions. So postcolonialism refers to different theoretical concepts, theoretical approaches, and theoretical interventions. And these approaches, concepts, etc., deal with the diverse effects of the interaction between the colonizer and the colonized. So, for example, Britishers were the colonizers and Indians were the colonized. Now, postcolonialism deals with the diverse effects of these these interactions coming together, contact, we can say, between the colonizer and the colonized. What happened after the Britishers came in India? Or what happened in other countries like African or Asian countries? It also refers to the conceptualization of the countries which were under the colonization. So post-colonialism is a kind of, what you call analysis. So we refer to as post-colonial analysis. We use the plural term here, as we talked about different approaches. There is no single way of analyzing as such. Therefore, the plural form analysis, SES, is used here. And when we understand post-colonialism as an approach, as a concept, as a theoretical intervention, the conceptualization focus of this analysis is very diverse. There is no uniform approach as such, no uniform method, no uniform way of understanding this concept. Means there are different methods, diverse methods. It's very diverse. And this is informed by different schools of thought. Yesterday we talked about feminism. So there were different schools. We say that feminists try to go for the linguistic analysis, the textual analysis. And there are different perceptions. So there are diverse schools of thought. As they draw upon from Marxism, postmodernism, post-structuralism, etc. So postmodern and Marxian approaches, there are postmodern and Marxian approaches, have significantly influenced the formation of all these discourses, what we call as post-colonial discourses. There is an influence of postmodernism and Marxism on postmodernism. And means we can say that post-colonial theories have their origin in all these kind of approaches. Therefore, according to origin, there is a distinct critical age in this, and therefore we use the plural term analysis, because it results into kind of diversity. They get different critical age, and they try to approach different discourses with different perceptions. Therefore, they have multi-level liberation and emancipation of communities. Even feminism can be understood as an emancipation movement. And post-colonialism is equally an emancipation movement. It aims at liberation, multi-level liberation and emancipation of the colonized communities. Not just the way women have been marginalized, the colonialized communities too have suffered from isolation, oppression, and discrimination because of colonialism. We Indians have undergone this experience. Same in the case of certain African countries and certain other countries from Latin America and even North America. So these communities have suffered from isolation. They were socially isolated on international level. They were oppressed and they were discriminated. So we know the fight of Martin Luther King against this discrimination and Indian freedom struggle. All that emerged because of these factors, because of oppression and discrimination. So postcolonial theories try to understand these things from a different perspective, from postmodernist perspective, from Marxian perspective. So there is a difference between postmodernism and Marxism. The vast differences between these two schools of thought create a diverse and inherently self-contradictory post-colonial analysis. We'll be talking about the charges, the criticism on post-colonialism in the latter part, in the last part of my presentation. So we need to understand that no theory is perfect as such. There is a criticism on it as well. There are charges on it. So there are rigorously debated, diverse, and self-contradictory, inherently self-contradictory post-colonial analysis. Now, when we talk about post-colonialism as a critical approach, as a critical theory, within this realm, certain aspects of post-colonialism are targeted by objection and criticisms. And what are these objections? For example, you might be knowing there is no homogeneity as such. There is no homogeneous discourse. Means post-colonial theories, post-colonialism in all, is criticized for the lack of homogeneous discourse and even for the fragmentation of oppressed people's experiences. Now, for example, we talk about the suffering of Black people, suffering of Dalits in India. So there are different perceptions of looking at the things. Therefore, there is a criticism on post-colonial theory. Means the theory has a different perception about the oppressed people's experiences. And this is because of what we call diversity, which is ill-defined. In the name of an ill-defined diversity. For example, we say that the African experiences are different from the experiences of Indians. And that has created a space for a heated debate within the communities of theorists, even scholars, activists, and social movements. So that we need to understand. There is no uniform theory as such. There is no homogeneous discourse, a single discourse as such. There is a kind of, we understand the suffering, the oppression, the suffering and oppression of the Black people from a different point of view, and the suffering of Indians from a different perspective. So this creates a problem in post-colonial theory. We shall be talking about all these things in the latter part of my discussion. Now, what is the need of post-colonialism? The question should arise in our mind. There are two questions that we should ask. The first is, what was it that gave rise to post-colonialism? Feminism, postmodernism, etc., or Marxism. What is the need of this separate way of thinking, critical school as such, critical theory? What was it that gave rise to postcolonialism? That is the first question. And the second question is, why was it that a study of the cultural dimension of imperialism became important? So these two questions that we need to understand why post-colonialism. Now, what gave rise to post-colonialism? First thing that gave rise, the first factor was independence movements around the world. that put an end to colonialism. For example, India got its freedom in the year 1947. Similarly, South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, all these countries got their independence. So independence movement around the world put an end to colonialism. But colonialism does not end there. The, the residual effects of imperialism continued. And so even after the independence, the residual effects, it is a psychological term you might be knowing. Sigmund Freud uses. So residual effects means in our memory, the effects of imperialism continue. And they continue to affect the cultures of all these erstwhile colonies, including India. This can be understood with reference to, this is one of the important early work that under post-colonialism, with reference to Franz Fanon's The Rest of the Earth, the book which was published in the year 1961. So this book is one such intervention in colonial discourse. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, with the publication of Will Ascop's The Empire Writes Back, by 1980s, a substantial body of Commonwealth literature had emerged. And in this, writers tried to make sense of the impact of colonialism. We can refer to Chinua Achebe's book, The Things Fall Apart over here. So all these writers try to make sense of the impact of colonialism on these colonial countries, on these colonies. And by this time, by 1980s, there was a greater awareness of the power relations between the West and the Third World cultures, the First World and the Third World. And all these factors together led to a study and analysis of colonialism and its after effects. So here's the answer to the question that we had asked in the beginning. Why post-colonialism? What gave rise to post-colonialism? Why it became the cultural dimension? Why the study became a kind of dimension of imperialism? Why it became important? So all these factors together contributed in the development of a study, post-colonial study. It gave rise to the analysis of post-colonialism and its after effects. So with this, I would like to go ahead now. We shall be talking about the major contributors in this context. Well, now we shall be talking about post-colonialism with reference to some of the major contributors. It will give you an idea regarding the variety, the diversity in post-colonial approach. The earliest, I can say, the earliest post-colonial theorist is Frantz Fanon. He was born in the French colony of Martinique, and he fought with the French in World War II, and he remained in France after the war to study medicine and psychiatry. And actually, he lived a very short life, we can see. He was born in the year 1925 and he died in 1961. So we can see that he lived for 36 years or so. In this short career and life, Fanon provides postcolonialism with two influential texts. These are very remarkable texts. The first one is Black Skin, White Mask, which was published in the year 1952. And the second one is The Rest of the Earth, which was published in the year 1961. In these two important works and whatever other works he had written, Fanon uses psychoanalytical theory. Look, I mentioned earlier there are different approaches in post-colonialism as well. Fanon uses psychoanalytical theory to examine the condition of blacks under French colonial rule. So this is what we need to understand. After examining the condition of blacks under French colonial rule, he asserts that as a result of colonialism, both the colonialized, for example, the other, that is any person defined different from. The term other, the other is used, and the colonizer, both the colonized and the colonizer suffer psychic warping, which causes what Fanon defines or describes as a collapse, I quote unquote, a collapse of the ego. So he is referring Sigmund Freud's theory over here, referring to ego, id, ego, and superego. So the second layer of mind is a collapse of the ego in both cases, not only in the case of the colonialized, but it happens in the case of colonizer. How we need to understand. Now, Fanon explains that as soon as the colonialized, here in this context, as he belongs to this place, the blacks living in Martinique were forced to speak the language of the colonizer, that is French. In our context, English. But what happens after that? Yes, we are talking about the after effect. When they were forced, the blacks living in Martinique were forced to speak the language of the other colonizer. The colonized either accepted or were forced into accepting by exploitation, by dominance. They're forced into accepting the collective consciousness of the French, to use what we call the term, psychological term. Okay. I don't remember. Means I know the name. Right now I'm not recollecting. Does anyone know who used the term? Well, look, Freud talks about individual consciousness. And who used the term collective consciousness? Can somebody mention it? Was it Jung? C.J. Jung, Carl Jung, I guess, right?
Yes,
so
sir, yes,
the consciousness of the French. Yes, they were, look, when we speak English, you know what Macaulay said regarding Indians. He wanted to have Indians by blood and flesh, Indians, but in their manners and etiquettes, they would be Britishers. The same thing happened in case of the blacks living in Martinique. They were the colonized. And they were forced to accept. They either accept, of course, in case of India as well, Indians as well. We accepted it willingly sometimes, and sometimes we were forced. Means coerce is the term used to refer to for the people to accept something by exploitation. So they were coerced into accepting the collective consciousness of the French. I hope you understand what we mean by the collective consciousness. For example, we Indians have a collective consciousness of being Indians. Means these people, blacks living in Martinique, were made to believe that they are French subjects. They were French subjects. Means they were forced to identify blackness with evil and sin, as the French people they thought. They looked at blackness with evil and sin, and the blacks living in Martinique were forced to accept it. They had to accept that blackness was equal to evil and sin. And in our culture as well, we are made to believe that blackness stands for what we call something which is ill omen, and whiteness with purity and righteousness. So this is what happened. This is the effect of colonization. This is the effect of accepting the language of the colonizers. Means you do not simply accept the language. You know it very well that language is the carrier of culture. So you're forced to accept the culture too. And they started thinking like the French citizens, the French people. So this is one of the important things that we need to understand, that the post-colonial theorists try to understand through the analysis. I continue with the discussion. In his important book, The Rest of the Earth, Fanon argues that an entirely new world must come into being to overcome this binary system. To use the linguistic term, binary opposition. So this binary system, there is a binary system. Might be knowing something about Saussure terminology. He talks about the binary system. So which binary system comes into being here? In this binary system, black is equal to evil and white is equal to good. So black and white become antonyms in this sense. And Fanon thinks that an entirely new world has to come into being, must come into being to overcome, to come out of this thinking. It has become the permanent mark of the culture. I remember a song, it was a folk song I used to listen to on radio in my childhood. So in our Indian culture as well, we have this binary system as such. आता तुम्हीच सांगा पाहुणं कुठं जातील काळ्या पोरी गोरा बी म्हणतो गोरीच पाहिजे काळाही म्हणतो काळी गोरीच पाहिजे. So we understand that it's not easy to accept blackness. So entirely new world should come into being to overcome this binary system. So after doing the psychoanalysis, he develops a Marxist influenced postcolonial theory. And in this theory, he calls for violent revolution. To bring this new world into being, we need to go for a violent revolution. A type of revolution in which Fanon himself was involved. He was not simply a thinker, rather he was an activist. He was involved when he became a participant and a spokesperson for the Algerian revolutionaries against France. So you might be knowing something about Algeria through the works of what we call. Can you mention the name of the author? The Stranger, The Outsider. He was an Algerian. Franz Kafka. So Kafka was also an Algerian, so he belongs to this. And Fanon was a spokesperson for the Algerian revolutionaries. If you read the works of Kafka, you realize the experience the Algerians had to undergo under the French rule. And in this revolution against France, he became a kind of spokesperson because he thought that a violent revolution is a kind of solution over this. And in this book, he further develops one of his major concerns. What is that? That the problem of the native bourgeoisie means the middle class who dominate the what we call culture, who dominate the society. To use Marx, this is a Marxist term. And the problem of the native bourgeoisie who assume power after the colonial powers. It happened in case of India as well. The Zamindars, the Watandars could be described as native bourgeoisie. And they assumed power after the colonial powers. When the colonial powers either peacefully departed or even been driven out. Of course, we accepted what we call so-called socialism, social capitalism, but native bourgeoisie dominated the scenario. We have kind of, what we call this Saranjam Shahi, feudalism, indirectly, after the independence. So similar scenario was created in there as well, in modern Q. These native people, these native capitalists, assumed the role of the colonial rulers. Look, the colonial powers means Britishers or others, French rulers, were either driven out by different independence movement or they themselves departed peacefully. In both cases, what happened was, in certain cases, in certain countries, they departed peacefully, and in certain cases, they were driven out. But in both cases, the native bourgeoisie assumed the power. Therefore, when we read Indian English literature written after 1952, after independence, you can see that there is a kind of restlessness. There's a kind of what we call dissatisfaction because the dreams were shattered. So Nissim Ezekiel and others wrote about the social conditions after independence because the dreams were shattered. Yes, Indians were optimistic that when the Britishers would go out, would leave the country, everything would become what we call a kind of utopia. But that never happened. So, Gore gele, Kare ale, aisa आपण मराठीत म्हणतो. The things never changed. So when such situation occurs, the native proletariat means the working class, the peasants, subalterns we can say, whom Fanon describes as the wretched of the earth. I hope I need not explain the term wretched. They have to live a very, what we call, pathetic life. So these proletariat, working class, are left on their own after the colonial powers left. And sometimes they were in a worse situation than before the conquerors arrived. If you read Indian literature in English, especially poetry written by Nissim Ezekiel and others, you will see this scenario. The situation of the working class was worse, actually, after the Britishers left. Because the kind of feudalism, indirectly, not visible feudalism as such, Means when you see the power structures now in India, especially in Maharashtra, you'll realize it. Feudalism continues in different forms. Of course, it is my personal opinion. You may disagree with that. Through their educational institutions, through other forms, this feudalism exists. So throughout his writings, Fanon articulates key postcolonial concerns. He talks about the otherness. He talks about the formation of subject formation. And his emphasis was on linguistic and psychoanalytic frameworks, on which postcolonialism will develop in the decades to follow. Now, if you see the context of India, you will realize it. Now, there is a kind of division between, earlier we can say haves and have-nots. But when we accepted English as one of what we call language of instruction, we have one of the language of instruction, we have this kind of division, English and Englishless masses, and it still continues. So he emphasizes on linguistic and psychoanalytical frameworks on which postcolonialism will develop in the decades to follow. Now, for example, in our National Education Policy 2020, there is a provision for mother tongue education. Now, the question is, whose mother tongue? So, the answers are not easy as such. Okay. After understanding Fanon, now we shall go ahead with the next contributor in the context of Asia. It was Edward Said, and he's well known for his book Orientalism and the Notion of Orientalism. Orientalism rather appeared in the year 1978. And Said looks at Orientalism as a discourse. He uses the term. As I mentioned earlier, he was under the influence of Michel Foucault. And he sees Orientalism as a discourse, a system of knowledge by which European culture was able to manage and even produce the Orient politically, sociologically, militarily, ideologically, scientifically, and imaginatively during the post-Enlightenment period. Now you see, we talk about the Enlightenment in Europe. Whatever happened after this Enlightenment period, it had a deep impact on the world itself. So he refers to this. For example, when we read Gauri Vishwanathan's book, not book as such, but essay, Currying Favor, in which he talks about the British educational and cultural policy. So he says that this policy rather intended to create an image of an ideal Englishman. Now, Britishers didn't know how to create this image in the minds of Indians. So they had two ways actually, through the actual image, means actual behavior and actions of the Britishers who lived in India, for example, the administrative officers, the military officers, etc. But when they tried to create this image, they realized that the behavior and action of the Britishers living in India was not ideal as such. So they failed to create that image. Now, then they started thinking of the other way. And they used the metaphorical way through art and literature. Therefore, English literature was introduced to Indians in late 19th century. in the year 1875 or so. Gauri Vishwanathan, in a study, refers to the fact that even Britishers were not introduced to William Shakespeare and others till that time, because there was a different kind of education system in Britain, in England. There was a different education system to create social political leaders for higher class, people belonging to aristocratic class. And there was a different education system for working class, in which they were made to they were expected to become ideal family man, middle class people, etc. And literature was introduced to them during the same period. British literature, I mean to say, of course, not all. Greek and Latin was taught to all these aristocratic people, and English literature. So this Enlightenment period I was referring to. So this is how the things were created. Indians were introduced to English literature, to canonical works, which were not even studied by the Britishers themselves. So along with the working class in Britain, we were introduced to British literature to create an image of an ideal Englishman. So in this regard, Said states, I quote unquote, taking the 18th century as a very roughly defined starting point, Orientalism can be defined as the corporate institution. Look, he uses the term the corporate institutions, just like Oxford, just like Cambridge, etc. For dealing with the Orient. Orient stands for the East, people of the East. For dealing with it by making statements about it. You might be knowing something about William Jones. William Jones translated Kalidasa's works into Latin first and then into English, because he found it easy to translate Sanskrit into Latin, and then he translated his own works from Latin to English. And this is how India came into being for Europeans through William Jones. Otherwise, India was not known to Europeans as such. Besides, they started looking at India from the perspective of the Orientalists, means Western people who studied Orient, not directly from us. They made statements about it. They started teaching it, settling it, being over it, means they started talking about it. In other words, Orientalism, in short, is a kind of Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. Now you need to understand, we started understanding Kalidasa from the perspective of William Jones. We started understanding our literature from their perspective. We started understanding India from the perspective of the Western people. This means, of course, Said wasn't talking about India in particular. He's talking about Asia, the East, the Orient. On the same page number 3, he acknowledges that he had found it useful to employ Foucault's notion of discourse, which were described by Foucault in his book, The Archaeology of Knowledge and Discipline of Punish. And on page 12 of this book, he makes an important statement. According to Said, Orientalism is not a mere political subject matter or a field that is reflected passively by culture, scholarship, or institutions. Nor is it a large and diffuse collection of texts about the Orient. nor is it representative and expressive of a nefarious means wicked, Western imperialist plot to hold down the Orient world. It was a kind of he's not simply talking about all these things. So what he says, it is rather a distribution on geographical awareness into aesthetics, scholarly, economic, sociological, and philosophical text. Orientalism is a distribution of geographical awareness into aesthetic, scholarly. As I said, a culture came to be studied, interpreted by the Western people. It is an elaboration not only of a basic geographical distinction, but also a whole sense of interest. So this is how he understands Orientalism. He interprets the term Orientalism. Orientalism is all about the study of East. And this study was undertaken by the Western scholar, the Occidental scholar. Occidental, by Occidental means Western. The opposite term to Orientalism is Occidental. So in his book, he establishes that stereotypes and ideology about the Orient was created as the other. And even the myths, look, in case of Indians, the Europeans were told, especially Britishers, through the works of William Jones and others, that as if India is all about the land of snake charmers, means these monkey men and all, Madaris. So such kind of picture was created. I came across one more statement when G.B. Shaw was asked about India. He had been to India once, and he traveled by train from Mumbai, then time Bombay, to Delhi. And you know what was the scenario in the then time? Means open defecation was the problem, has been the problem till date. And when he was asked about his opinion about India, he simply said India is a big toilet, because he saw people sitting along the railway tracks in the morning. So that made an impression. And that became a kind of what we call our identity in Europe and in Britain especially. So these kind of myths were created then time as well. Imagine a situation when there was no media and all. So people relied on what these authors wrote about India. And this Orient as the author helped to produce myths about the laziness, deceit, and irrationality. Means for them, the Orient, the Indians were what we call lazy people. Now, Said is not talking simply about Indians. I'm just referring to India, the views of Britishers about Indians. Same are the case of Asians. There were myths that these Asian peoples were lazy, they were deceitful, they are dacoits and all, and they were irrational. Such kind of discourses of Orientalism were created. And by such kind of discourses, Western cultural institutions are responsible for the creation of this difference between self and others. Orients were others and they were self. So the Orientals very different from the Occidental. As I mentioned earlier, by Occidental we mean the Western people. This helps establish that opposition by which Europe's own identity can be established. Means they wanted to create. Now, this is very much psychological, human tendency. By making others bad, we try to become good. The same thing happened in case of these Oriental scholars. They wanted to establish a good image of Europeans. And in that attempt, they tried to prove that the Orientals were bad, the other. So the knowledge of the Orient created by and embodied within the discourse of Orientalism served to construct an image of the Orient. As I mentioned earlier, the Orientals were shown as subservient, and they thought that, you might be knowing about, the Britishers' tendency. Indians for them were what you call effeminate, childish, barbaric, and therefore, being the sensible manner, what you call the people of manner, they have the right to rule over India, dominate over the Indians. So the knowledge of subject races or Orientals make their management easy and profitable. They try to create such kind of what we call image of the Orientals. And this knowledge is generated out of strength. Power was used. And such strength generated knowledge. And this creates the Orient and the Oriental world. So these frameworks were created and the Oriental were presented through that. So ultimately, what we understand in the end is that on page number 36 of his book, Said states, knowledge gives power. More power requires more knowledge, and so on in an increasingly profitable dialectic of information control. So they took the control of knowledge. And look, they tried to use their own domains, their own knowledge system to control the Orients, the Indians in the context of Britishers. Okay, and now I would like to, looking at the time, I'm just trying to skip some of the things. I'm focusing only on the important aspects. Now we shall be talking about the next contributor, Gayatri Chakravarti Svyok. And she is a leading contemporary feminist deconstructionist. And she pays careful attention to issues of gender and race. And she used the term subaltern in the context of the marginalized people. And this term, as I mentioned earlier, was first used by the Italian thinker Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci used this term to refer to a subordinate position in terms of class, gender, race, and culture. So subaltern studies emerged from the term subaltern. It was Ranjit Guha who introduced it actually to Indians, and it became a kind of parallel movement to cultural studies, discipline to cultural studies. So subaltern studies can be understood as a kind of the form of cultural studies in India. And Spivak in our essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, addressed the way the subaltern, quote unquote, woman is constructed. He talks in the context of woman as absent or silent, or the one who is not listened to at all. She refers to this muteness of women in post-colonial societies, which become the major issue in her work. Now, in this work, Can the Subaltern Speak?, she puts forth the argument that between patriarchy and imperialism, subject constitution, for example, we just now refer to Edward Said's idea of subject constitution, how Orientals are constituted, and object formation, the figure of woman disappears not into pristine nothingness, but into a marginal position between tradition and modernization. So this is how she talks about the subaltern, especially in the context of her feminist idea. So she talks about the marginalization of women. And see, now parallels, what we call, see, identifies patriarchy with imperialism. Imperialism is a kind of patriarchy. Wow. And see, use this term subaltern. Subaltern can be understood as a floor rank for women, blacks, the colonized, and the working class, the proletariats. And this term comes to suggest the repressive dominance of white Western thinking and even an allegory of the displacement of the gendered and colonized. That is subaltern subject. Now, this happens by the imposition of narratives of internationalization and nationalism. Homogeneity means we try to bring homogeneity. We try to bring in the something similar in the form of nationalism. So it happens through this, and the violence inflicted by Western forms of thought upon the East is of great concern to Spivak. The third world they refer to is a kind of creation of the West, and that this concept locks non-Western cultures into an imperial representation. And she gives the name worlding to the process through which colonized space, quote unquote, is brought into the world. I'm just going fast now. And that is made to exist as part of world essentially. And this is constituted by Eurocentrism. Everything comes from Europe. That's what she says. The last thinker is Homi Bhabha. Now, Homi Bhabha's term mimicry can be understood in this context. The term is used to refer to a gap between the norm of civility as represented by European Enlightenment, okay, and its distorted colonial imitation. Yes, we can understand it as a gap. Mimicry is a very common term, I know. I hope you know, all of you. It designates a gap between the norm of civility. Mimicry is a kind of imitation as represented by, as presented by European Enlightenment. Means we try to follow the norm of civility, which was given by European people, European thinkers, philosophers, etc. And what we follow in the colonial countries. You might be knowing something about the term in language, intra-language, means which is neither like English nor like Hindi or Marathi. There is another term for it. So it is a kind of fossilized variety, fossilization we say. So this kind of distorted imitation means these people are neither like Western nor like Indians. So such kind of imitation is referred to as mimicry. And this serves as the sly weapon of anti-colonial civility. It is a mixture of deference and disobedience. And to Bhabha, this weapon means the operations of the unconscious in the imperial context are far from simple, because desire for as well as fear of the other, means we try to understand, does not allow the identities of the colonizer and the colonized to say fixed and unitary. We don't have fixed identity as such, in both cases. So colonial power undermines its own authority, and therefore there is a native resistance to this authority. So this kind of scenario is marked by hybridity. So mimicry, the concept of mimicry, through that he talks about hybridity, in between space. It is neither like this nor like that. It's created. So this is how we understand the term mimicry and hybridity. I'm going a bit faster now, considering the time's constraints. Now, we'll try to understand it briefly with reference to Said's interpretation intervention of Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad's book. His 1966 books, the fiction Joseph Conrad and the fiction of autobiography, written by Said, is different from his comments on Conrad's Heart of Darkness in Culture and Imperialism, another work. In this book, Cultural Imperialism, he says, this narrative is connected directly with the redemptive force, as well as the West and horror of Europe's mission in the dark world. Whatever is lost or elided or simply made up in Marlowe is a character from this particular book. Immensely compelling recitation is compensated for in the narrative see a historical momentum, the temporal forward movement. This is a very technical comment. Let us understand what he's trying to say. To say imperative politics and aesthetics which Heart of Darkness embodies was in the closing years of the 19th century, and aesthetics, politics, and epistemology. So I refer to what we call Chinua Achebe's book. Chinua Achebe was the Nigerian author who saw Heart of Darkness as out and out of a racist book. He looks at it as a racist book. I'll skip this part. I will provide the PPT to the organizers. Now, these are some of the things that we need to understand. The general characteristic of reading in postcolonial criticism is that a text is read back from the perspective of the colonized. Yesterday we saw that the feminists claimed that the text can be read back from the perspective of feminist thinkers. The gender has a role to play. So we can read all these books from the perspective of the colonized. And if you read the book from this perspective, it rejects the claims to be universalism made on behalf of canonical Western literature. We start denying, for example, the character of Shylock, the way he's narrated, the way he's presented in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. We start looking at him from a different perspective. We reject the idea, the presentation of the character, the way the character is presented before us. So this kind of reading seeks to show its limitations of outlook, especially in its general inability to emphasize across boundaries of cultural and ethnic difference. It means we start thinking from not from an Eurocentric perspective. We start thinking from a diverse point of view. Now, what are the challenges? This is very significant to understand in post-colonial reading or in this theory. As I mentioned earlier, one of the challenges for post-colonial theory today is to come to terms with specific local conditions. Means there can be similar perception within the culture where we are living in, and with comparison that can be discerned in and between them. Means this otherness is created within the surrounding, with the situation in which you are living. And one daunting task of that is another challenge, trying to know the story of colonial and neo-colonial engagements in all their complexity. I'm going faster, I'm sorry for that. And another challenge is finding a proper language and terminology for representing those engagements. For example, we have to use Western theory itself. You need to come up with our own theory. That is a major challenge. So in the end, I would like to just refer to two thinkers, critics. One is Azaz Ahmad, an Indian critic. He objects that postcolonial theories live and do their theories in first world countries. That's the problem. All these thinkers, Homi Bhabha, for example, Gayatri Spivak, for example, Edward Said, for example, they live there in the first world, that is, in European countries or in America. And that affects the impact of their work. Another critic, Arif Derulik, sees the postcolonial intellectual as complicit in feeding into the goals of the capitalist frame. One more critic, Appaya, argues that the post, quote unquote, a postcolonial theory and postmodernism are spaces created by capitalism to market cultural products in the developing world. So these are the charges. Rather, it needed means I went through certain slides very fast because it may need one more hour or more than that. Therefore, I try to skip the part. So these are some of the important works. Thank you very much.